Thank you everyone for coming, and thanks particularly to our distinguished presenters. This is the second presentation or the second seminar in the seminar series of the Tunisian Observatory for Food Sovereignty and the Environment, where we are presenting a monthly seminar series on issues dealing with the environment, ecology, development, climate, and pandemics. The languages of it are obviously depending on the linguistic capacities of our presenters. Since some of us are American, our linguistic capacities are, of course, very low. So this seminar, including its coordinator, is in English. Today the Observatory for Food Sovereignty and the Environment is a nonprofit research entity working on exactly the above issues, specifically in the Tunisian, but more also in the African and Arab contexts. And for our seminar series today, we have 3 guests who we will present in turn right before their presentations, and who will be presenting on various aspects of the pandemic. So we are the first presenter who I have the great honor to introduce you to today is Vera Ameli, who will be presenting on issues of corona and public health responses. And she is a doctoral candidate at the University of Oxford, using an interdisciplinary approach to understand the political, structural, sociocultural, and institutional context of public health problems and policies. Her thesis focuses on access and adherence to treatment among people living with HIV in Iran and the broader Middle East and North Africa. And her work has appeared in New Left Review, British Medical Journal, and other scientific and journalistic outlets. So we are going to start with Vera, and over to you, please.
Thank you very much for having me as part of this seminar. It feels nice to be in Iran, but I feel like I'm in Tunisia. So I would like to begin my talk with a quote. For people who want the truth, adequate evidence is enough. But for those who don't want the truth, overwhelming evidence is inadequate. So this is a tweet actually by Professor Thuli Manansela, who is an advocate in South Africa. And I'm a researcher at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention, and I'm pursuing my doctorate within the Center for Evidence-Based Intervention. So I spend a lot of time thinking about what kinds of evidence are most useful for enhancing decisions that inform policy. I specifically focus on the public health context in Iran, and currently we are living in times of public health crisis, a crisis that has created an unprecedented chaos of numbers, challenging our efforts to track the virus, even as epidemiologists and biostatisticians. But we are also experiencing this global pandemic in a post-truth era, an era that there is a war on information, and an era in which evidence itself is politicized and weaponized, both within media and even in some academic discourses. So in this talk, I will elaborate on what I see as a dual war on health and information. The pandemic bitterly taught us that even scientific information is not immune to politicization. And politicization not only hinders global collaboration, but also slows scientific progress. And this campaign of disinformation that demonizes any non-Western scientific achievements also conceals Western attempts at monopolizing science itself. So this politicization of information we saw from the beginning and the early days of the pandemic to today's attempts to vaccinate the global population. From the early days of the pandemic, more effective public health responses in East Asian countries, including China, were often attributed to anything but an effective public health response. It was attributed to totalitarian response or anything but actually reading it as an effective public health response. On the other hand, Iran's pandemic fate was under a triple onslaught of the virus itself, severe economic sanctions, and a media war. And this media war was used the pandemic as an opportunity for demonizing the Iranian government, the Islamic Republic, rather than exposing the outbreak as an emergency for extending cooperation. Whilst it is essential to question the actions of any national government in times of health crises, the purpose of critical discussion should be public health benefits, not political gains. Yet the disparaging Western coverage of Iran's response to the crisis had the opposite effect, namely the media campaign to delegitimize the Islamic Republic, undermined global health efforts by impeding the flow of accurate information. The extent to which epidemiological analysis of Iran's experience was derailed by these orthogonal denunciations should be clear enough from the fact that the US, UK, and France all failed to avoid similar public health miscalculations as Iran did earlier in the pandemic. As you know, Iran experienced the pandemic after China and before Western Europe. So examples of this were abound. For example, when Iran's deputy health minister and other government officials tested positive for coronavirus, it was evidence of the dysfunctional Iranian response to the virus. But when politicians in the US, UK, and Canada contracted the illness, no such sensationalism was in order. When Iran imposed a ban on travel to its northern cities early on in the pandemic, the Western media condemned it, the Guardian's headline, declaring Iran threatens force to resist travel. Yet the ban was not a police measure, was only a police measure and not a military lockdown. And ironically, later Iran was criticized for not having implemented a ban on travel early enough. Virtually every decision that was taken by the Iranian government, whatever its merit or demerit, was subject to relentless media disparagement from all sides of the Western political spectrum. So restricting travel was portrayed as an abuse of power, while not doing so was denounced as risking lives. Holding elections showed disregard for public health. Canceling it would mean an excuse to avoid low voter turnout. And this asymmetrical pattern of condemnation added a further dimension of chaos and complexity to an already complex and challenging humanitarian crisis in a country that was also under economic sanctions. Regarding vaccines, Iran's decision to not look exclusively westward has been criticized, but Iran is considering all possible means to vaccinate its population. It's actually one of the only countries that is considering a variety of options, including importing from Russia, collaborating with Cuba, securing any vaccine that it can through COVAX, and producing domestically. And when the leader of Iran banned the import of vaccines that were produced by Iran's geopolitical opponents, such as the US and UK, an outburst of condemnation across mainstream media was observed. But it seems to go unnoticed that it is not a crime to say no to Western vaccines, but the West hoarding of vaccines, the UK and US buying 3 times the amount of vaccines that they would need for their population, and blocking the World Trade Organization from removing intellectual property rights for scaling up generic productions, as it was requested by India and South Africa, were indeed global health crimes, or they should be considered global health crimes. The West even tried to go against evidence to portray the Russian vaccine, which was more easily accessible for some countries, as ineffective or unsafe, and politicize this scientific evidence. So if coronavirus has made one thing clear, it has been that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Yet, rather than breaking the chain of viral transmission, the media war breaks the chain of knowledge transmission, jeopardizing the health of global populations. Now, it would be important for us, for our seminar purposes, to take a step back and ask a few questions regarding how this knowledge through media is produced and on what kind of evidence it hinges on, or how is evidence being used. So I would raise two questions for the purpose of discussion, and that is, what is evidence and how does evidence persuade? As someone with a Master of Public Health degree who studied epidemiology and before that biochemistry, I am trained in the scientific principles of evidence-based medicine, which is designed for a specific purpose that resonates best in the ethos of medicine itself, which in a bit of Latin by Hippocrates from many centuries ago, it reads, primum non nocere, first do no harm. And this is a good principle, and it has guided clinical practice, saving patients from potentially initially unknown harms for centuries. But evidence-based medicine is methods-focused and puts results from randomized controlled trials, for example, on top of the hierarchy of evidence, or any quantitative data on top of the hierarchy of evidence. So the principle of waiting for the definitive randomized controlled trial or quantitative results before taking policy action should not be seen as inviolable or as always defining good science, especially for social and behavioral policies and interventions. On the contrary, this principle, when inappropriately applied, will distort our perception of what good science is. And the problem was most evident when public health professionals in the beginning of the pandemic took months to come to a consensus on whether masks should be required or not, or whether coronavirus is airborne or it transmits through droplet. And this was because evidence-based medicine training teaches us to downgrade studies or kinds of evidence that have a lesser research importance or design than an RCT. But if we over-apply this rule of thumb, we end up dismissing the very study designs that might provide the richest insights into how the complex system, which is what we are living in, is behaving like. So more specifically, taking a primum non nocere, don't act till we've got RCT certainty stance, when hundreds are dying daily, makes no scientific or moral sense. As Professor Trish Greenhaw, professor of medicine in Oxford, has said it is neither scientifically nor morally reckless to try out policies that have a plausible chance of working out. And again, evidence on mask use or coronavirus being airborne were both a victim of these types of outlooks. So if this was a critique of sort of like the scientific community's use of evidence, now we can shift to the second question, which is how evidence persuades. And especially within our post-truth world and within the contaminated sphere of mainstream media narratives on countries that are outside the globalized order. To think about how evidence persuades, we can briefly go back to Aristotle in his writings on rhetoric. He said evidence, or logos, is only one component of the art of persuasion. The two other components are the credibility of the speaker, which is ethos, and the appeal to emotions, which is pathos. So it's logos, the actual evidence, and the ethos, which is the credibility of the speaker, and pathos, which is emotions. And in our post-truth era, contrary to the inviolable nature of evidence-based medicine, where logos becomes the most important bit, the evidence or logos bit in this post-truth world, and this bit of the triangle gets so diminutive to the extent that we can actually discount it altogether. And we are talking only about who is the speaker, which is the power of the mainstream media, and what is the appeal to emotions, which is basically how easy it is to demonize one country or one group or otherize one population or another. So when we hear narratives on Iran or other countries that are considered to be outside of the global order or resisting the global order, and this dynamic is a constant. Evidence becomes almost entirely irrelevant, and instead we focus on the credibility of the speaker, which is the power of international media, and the appeal to emotions, which is, in this case, managing public emotions and demonizing Iran, Venezuela, or other governments, Russia, whatever the need is at that moment. So a good example of this was when, without credible evidence, powerful media outlets accused the Ministry of Health of Iran of hiding the toll of coronavirus by massive orders of magnitude, such as 20 times. Well, not even the Iranian government itself or Ministry of Health officials were claiming that their numbers were exactly accurate. And I don't think any country can claim that. But fact checking, when making claims about these faux countries, whether on claims with regards to Russian vaccine or Iranian pandemic numbers in times of sanctions, simply ignores the logos or evidence bit. The bar for fact checking is very low when speaking about countries and peoples that are otherized or demonized. And accusations on this low level of evidence are never made against Western countries by Western media. But in the case of these countries, we are fully in this post-truth world, and the mere purpose is to ignore evidence. And the practice harms ordinary people of these countries as it obscures suffering caused by these dominant international pressures, such as sanctions, etc., and it shifts the blame on the governments of these countries. And it limits solidarity during a global pandemic, and it harms scientific collaboration and progress. The lack of solidarity and the demonization of these countries not only occurs through mainstream media outlets, but it is also disseminated through social media apps. WhatsApp messages that promote despair and distrust among populations have long been used during election times. And these are psychological operations that are sometimes organized by governments and sometimes even by companies such as Facebook that can have long-term effects in producing a population level of despair, which is a precursor to serious mental health problems, harmful drug use, migration, and brain drain in countries that are not lucky enough to be viewed favorably by the imperialist mainstream media outlets. So to conclude, we must move in the direction of premium non nocere, first do no harm within our media and academic discourses, but we must also use evidence that is credible and applicable to each situation or decision at hand to not harm populations in order to wait for the best kind of data.
Okay, that was below your allotted time, so we hope you will have more to say in the discussion. But this was a wonderful presentation, and thank you very much. We are now going to move on to Rob Wallace, who will be discussing how farmer autonomy and community control of food landscapes are the bases for reintroducing the agrobiodiversities that keep deadly pandemics from emerging in the first place. Rob is an evolutionary epidemiologist with the Agroecology and Rural Economics Research Corps in St. Paul, Minnesota. He is the author of Big Farms Make Big Flu and co-author of Dead Epidemiologists on the Origins of COVID-19. And he has consulted for the Food and Agriculture Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So thank you very much, Rob, and over to you.
Thank you. Bonjour à tous, c'est un plaisir d'être ici. Mon français n'est pas le meilleur. Je parle comme une vache américaine et je parlerai en anglais aujourd'hui, mais j'apprécie l'invitation. Wow, okay. There is a fascist apocryphal that under Mussolini, the trains in Italy ran on time. Of course, truth and rightist authoritarianism are rarely synonymous. Indeed, often quite the contrary to the ultimate collapse of both the state and the population health it bears responsibility for. The trains didn't run on time. Mussolini banned all reports of railway delays and accidents. Here in the United States, President Trump pushed much the same way against a different set of daily reports. Several times this past year, he spoke on the virtues of an epidemiological agnotology, the study of ignorance. When you test, you find something is wrong with people, he said. If we didn't do any testing, we would have very few cases, end quote. All to the tune of 500,000 COVID-19 deaths in the richest country in the history of humanity. That doesn't mean, however, that the present political alternative is free of blame. One might justifiably sigh in relief at President Biden's election as the return of the adults, but are there adults in charge in a country without a national health service? Indeed, 40 years of neoliberalism neglected and monetized American public health, such as it was, spinning off such interventions down to the doctor-patient relationship, or only for those who could afford such hospital visits. For even under Obamacare, 28 million Americans are still without health insurance, and 44 million more are underinsured. Combined, that's over 6 times the total population of Tunisia. I mean, can you imagine such a gap in public health when you've kind of abandoned public health, said it's the doctor-patient relationship, and then you don't allow people to go see the doctor? So this is all without the capacity or interest, even now, in contact tracing and community health visits. The same extends to rent and food. Millions of Americans were left to their devices, leading to hundreds of thousands of documented cases of excess COVID, just by virtue of not being able to pay rent and being kicked out of your house. So long before Trump, the US, despite its reputation, was in serious, as a reputation as a developed country, was in serious trouble upon any pandemic's eventual arrival. Such willful neglect across the globe extends back to the origins of the pandemic, along with, looking forward, the putative reset capital and its state representatives now propose. Despite the batch of new vaccines to which very few worldwide have access, SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus behind COVID-19, remains on the march. It's still infecting hundreds of thousands of people a day the world over. In countries that handled the outbreak badly, among them the US, Britain, Brazil, and now India, government rhetoric had at times even suggested letting the virus largely run its course. With little scientific backing, it was bandied that the mythical herd immunity, leaving millions dead in its wake, would save us. Agribusiness likely proclaimed that the industry that helped loose many of the century's deadly outbreaks offers exactly the right path forward. So we have the likes of the Animal Agriculture Alliance and the Breakthrough Institute. They say agricultural biosecurity, technology, and economies of scale, bigger is better, are the only way to protect us from another pandemic. Never mind that agribusiness production and land grabs conducted in its name are documented to have driven the emergence of multiple pathogens the past 2 decades. How do we arrive at a historical moment when the very causes of the ongoing crisis are repeatedly presented as its solution? Modern agriculture emerged hand in hoof with capitalism, the global slave trade, and science. Early European powers deployed the first imperial scientists to decode the new landscapes and peoples their ships encountered on their voyages of conquest. Imperial science also helped recode these lands and peoples back into subjects for capital accumulation. From Europe and Africa, the various stages of capitalism that followed expanded across the Americas, the Caucasus, and the tropics, turning locally tended food landscapes into export commodities. From 1700 to 2017, large-scale croplands and pasture expanded 5-fold to 27 million square kilometers. The practice of industrializing livestock and crop production took off to new heights after the Second World War. To summarize the entirety of recent modern agriculture in 2 sentences, if you allow me. So what do we have now? We have 40% of Earth's ice-free surface is now dedicated to agriculture and represents the planet's largest biome. Many millions more hectares are to be brought into production by 2050, especially in the global south, where what little virgin farmland remains to be cut out of the last of the rainforests and savannas. The poultry and livestock alive today represent 72% of global animal biomass, far surpassing the total biomass of vertebrate wildlife. Industrialized food animals are beginning to spread across the globe in veritable cities of pigs and chickens. What was once planet Earth has been turned into planet farm. These expansions are networked by circuits of capital and consumption. The circuits source an increasing volume of trade in live animals, produce, processed food, and germplasm. The growing patches of monoculture are characterized by declining diversity in animals and crops, as technical interventions select a few genetic breeds over all others. Varieties are also being lost as agricultural companies consolidate. And there's a terrible irony that as the companies consolidate, the variety of geneticists actually declines as well. So they're all losing jobs by virtue of their success. Such economically driven shifts have produced profound impacts upon both our ecology and public health. The production of limited lines of monogastric species, primarily pigs and poultry, is displacing locally adapted breeds of a wide variety of animals across non-industrial countries. Similar trends are found in crops, feeding both human populations and the industrial livestock. Along agricultural advance, primary natural habitat and non-human populations are contracting at record rates, destroying indigenous and smallholder land and livelihoods along the way. Deforestation and development are increasing the rate, the taxonomic scope of pathogen spillover and wildlife to food animals and the laborers who tend them. COVID-19 represents only one of a series of novel pathogen strains who have suddenly emerged or re-emerged in the 21st century as threats to humanity. These outbreaks, avian and swine influenza, Ebola, Macona, Q fever, Zika, among many others, have all been tied to changes in production or land use associated with intensive agriculture, as well as logging and mining. Pathogens emerge differently depending upon place and commodity. But all these are connected within the same web of environmental damage and global expropriation, which explains the cross-continental nature of the new pathogens. SARS in China, MERS in the Middle East, Zika in Brazil, H5N6 in Europe, swine flu H1N1 in North America. How does production drive these outbreaks? At one end of a region's nascent commodity chain, the diverse complexity of primary forests typically bottles up wild pathogens. Potential hosts are irregularly encountered in a functioning forest. But transnational logging, mining, intensive agriculture change these dynamics. They drastically streamline that natural complexity. While many pathogens on such neoliberal frontiers die off along with their host species, a subset of infections that once burned out relatively quickly in the forest can suddenly propagate much more widely. And Ebola offers a classic example. Since the mid-1970s, Ebola outbreaks typically besieged a sub-Saharan village or two before dying out. And the death rates are terrible, but it dies off in relatively short order. But in 2013 to 2015, the Macona strain emerged along a frontier of monoculture oil palm and other crops out of an increasingly expropriated and globalized West African landscape. Although little differentiated in its genetics or clinical course compared to previous Ebola outbreaks, the Macona strain would go on to infect 35,000 people, killing thousands living in major cities and suddenly only a flight away from the rest of the world. It's less about the virus than the new context in which the viruses are emerging, and that goes back into the history of humanity. Briefly, HIV emerged out of southeastern Cameroon at the turn of the 20th century as the French and Germans were fighting over who had colonial control. They built a new production circuit, bringing log and rubber tapping from the deepest forest to the coast for export to Europe. So SIVs that had been spilling over into locals for, if not decades, hundreds of years, suddenly have a new geography in which to emerge, and that's how HIV-1 emerged. So this is not a new story. So that's at one end. That's at the end of the production at the forest edge, but other diseases are emerging at the other end of the production chain. So we have deadly and human-adapted avian and swine influenzas that typically crop up. Intensive operations are located near major cities in both the global north and south. Of the 39 documented transitions from low to high deadliness in avian influenzas from 1959 onwards, all but 2 occurred in commercial poultry operations, typically of hundreds of thousands of birds. Intensive operations are so inundated with circulating avian and swine influenza that they now serve as their own reservoirs for new strains. You don't have to blame wild waterfowl anymore for that. They are their own host at this point. What is it about industrial farms that makes them breed such infections? Industrial turkeys are grown in barns of 15,000 birds. Industrial layers, those are the hens that lay eggs, are stocked in barns of up to 250,000 birds. Growing animals in vast monocultures removes the immune fire breaks that would ordinarily cut off outbreaks in more diverse populations. Pathogens routinely evolve around the now commonplace host immune genotype of the industrial livestock. You also have overcrowding and poor hygiene that induces the kind of intense stress in food animals, presses the immune response and makes them more vulnerable to infection. Housing high concentrations of livestock and poultry rewards those strains that can burn through them the fastest. So it's like the perfect model of selecting the most deadly pathogens. Animals now are slaughtered at ever earlier ages, growing out chickens to only 6 weeks, and pigs in 22 weeks can select for greater pathogen deadliness, including infections that are able to survive younger and more robust immune systems. And they're operating under this all-in, all-out production. It's an attempt to control outbreaks by growing livestock in batches, but that unwittingly selects for an infection threshold that lines up with the finishing times that the industry sets for its herds and flocks. That is, successful strains evolve life histories that are killing grown-out farm animals near slaughter, whence the stock is most valuable to farmers. So you don't have any reproduction on site. There's no industrial hog, or chickens do not breed on site. All the breeding is done offshore, largely for market traits like more meat and fast growth. So the livestock populations are unable to evolve resistance to circulating pathogens. As survivors do not breed, they cannot pass on their resistance. So, and I go to the small farmers, like, you guys are already doing wonderful efforts to control disease by virtue of letting your animals breed on site. And they're like, well, of course, that's how smallholders do it. So it's like, it's remarkable the way industrial production is all organized around, doing the worst things possible if you had to engineer it for selecting deadly pathogens. So beyond the farm gate, the increasing distance live animals are shipped country to country has expanded the diversity of genetic segments that pathogens exchange, increasing the rate and combinations over which diseases explore their evolutionary possibilities. The greater the variation in their genetics, the faster the pathogens evolve. So in short, in industrializing meat production, global agribusiness is also industrializing the pathogens that circulate among its livestock and poultry. All right, so what does this have to do with COVID-19? COVID-19 origins are something of a mixture of these two ends of our circuits of production, both the forest and the industrial farm. Coronaviruses are hosted by bats around the world, but the strain that bats host in China, particularly the horseshoe bats, appears to hit humans worse once it successfully jumps species. The environment in which these bats live has also changed in foundational ways. Upon its economic liberalization, post-Mao, China undertook the BRICS route of development, intent on feeding its own people with its own natural resources. Millions were pulled out of poverty, millions were left behind. Pro or con, it's not my business, especially as American, in terms of whether or not that was the right course. But Chinese agribusiness and an increasingly capitalized wild food sector have cut into the landscape of Central and South China, where many of these bat populations are located. As with Ebola, the interfaces between the bats, livestock, wild food animals, farmers, and miners on this commodity frontier expanded, boosting the traffic of various SARS-like coronaviruses. There's also something that we thought of, it's the possibility that the increasing pesticide application, and in China, it's at a scale even beyond the drenched United States, may have reduced the insect population that these bats fed on. And this may have increased the interface coronavirus hosts shared with human populations as bats expanded their foraging range looking for food. With the wild foods and agricultural production lines increasing in extent and speed, many a SARS-like coronavirus that successfully spilled over into a food animal or into a human could now make its way in short order across the peri-urban landscape to regional capitals such as Wuhan before hopping on the global travel network. All right, this sounds terrible, right? It sounds like a total trap, like such a vicious cycle of circumstances. Is there anything we can do? And I'd say, yes, there is. We must first reject the normal that brought us this mess. And the entire apparatus, and Vera was getting at it, is organized around maintaining these relationships of colonization and dominance on the global scale within countries and so on and so forth. And we need to reject that because growing food from this vantage point isn't about making objects. Food items aren't widgets. Agriculture must be turned away from its industrial economy back to something more like a natural economy. And we must return to assimilating and respect for food's context. And I don't mean it in a metaphysical sense. I mean in the sense, even in a functional sense, the soil, water, air, ecological matrix, the community well-being on which food and people who eat it depend. So to get back to a point that Vera raised, The kind of epistemological aspects of this and the more, have to be normalized in the sense of, brought into notions of values and what we want out of the world. So evidence and justice are not separated from each other. And that's a line that Richard Levins was adamant about, and he's proving very much correct. Injustice produces bad science. And so to box out the deadliest of pathogens, we must preserve forest and wetland complexity, maintaining the kind of ecological buffers across bats, geese, other natural disease reservoirs, our food animals, and our communities. We must reintroduce agrobiodiversity into livestock and poultry to serve as a kind of immunological firebreak against deadly pathogens, both on farms and across whole landscapes. We must return to letting livestock reproduce on site so that herds and flocks can protect themselves against pathogens in real time. Such interventions require restoring the locus of control to farmers and rural communities and away from agribusiness. So in short, to keep the worst of outbreaks from emerging in the first place, we must turn to the kind of state planning that centers farmer autonomy, community socioeconomic resilience, circular economies, integrative cooperative supply networks, community land trusts, and reparations. We must undo deeply historical race, class, and gender trauma at the center of land grabbing and environmental alienation, extending back to the age of colonialism. On the world stage, we must end the unequal ecological exchange between global north and south. Healing the metabolic rift between ecology and economy that drives pathogen emergence and climate damage at the heart of modern agriculture involves planting a different political philosophy. Now, betting that agribusiness, the major source of the pandemic we started with, will provide the solution is really a futile notion. I mean, we can do much better thinking and acting toward the ways of living that will allow humanity and population health their place on our planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was wonderful. And before moving on to the discussion, we have a third presentation. Nous avons, and it will be in French, so I will introduce it in French. Nous avons maintenant notre troisième orateur de la journée. C'est Konkobo Herman Moussa, doctorant à l'université Joseph Zigerbo, une socio-historienne, et il va faire une présentation sur perception et impact de la COVID-19 à Burkina Faso à début de la maladie. Merci beaucoup, Konkobo, s'il vous plaît.
Merci bien. Je vais également à mon tour m'excuser pour le fait que mon anglais n'est pas aussi détaillé pour pouvoir faire la présentation effectivement en anglais. Donc, ceci étant, je voudrais déjà féliciter les deux autres intervenants, ou c'est les trois autres intervenants qui viennent de passer tout à l'heure. En ce qui concerne ma présentation porte effectivement sur les représentations sociales et l'impact économique de la pandémie et de la COVID-19 dans le secteur de l'artisanat minier au Burkina Faso. Donc, à ce propos, comme vous l'avez dit, ma présentation sera structurée en quatre parties. Et le premier point porte sur le contexte et la justification un peu de la thématique de l'étude. Et ensuite, nous reviendrons par exemple sur les objectifs et les hypothèses qui ont prévalu lors de cette étude. Et la troisième et quatrième point, c'est l'approche méthodologique qui a été abordée pour aboutir enfin au quatrième point qui est les résultats de l'étude. Donc, en ce qui concerne le premier point, notamment le contexte de réalisation de la présente étude sur les représentations sociales et l'impact économique de la pandémie de la COVID et dans le secteur de l'artisanat minier. Et je reviendrai uniquement sur un seul point en ce qui concerne le contexte. Et il faut dire que le secteur minier artisanal au Burkina Faso, de façon globale, le secteur minier représente près de 75% et 75% des recettes budgétaires du Burkina Faso. Donc, c'est un secteur très important et particulièrement en ce qui concerne le secteur minier artisanal que nous appelons l'exploitation minière artisanale à petite échelle, si vous voulez. Mais ça, c'est un autre concept également qui est lié un peu à l'artisanat minier. Il faut dire que ce secteur est le plus important du fait qu'elle emploie environ 2 millions, effectivement, de personnes actives au Burkina Faso dans ce secteur. Et en plus de cela, c'est que ce secteur dispose de plus de 200 sites d'exploitation artisanale répartis sur l'ensemble des 12 régions minières sur les 13 régions que compte le pays. Donc, voyez-vous que c'est un secteur effectivement très important, mais qui développe une économie informelle, du fait que ce n'est pas un secteur aussi structuré qui est connecté à l'économie formelle. Donc, du coup, lorsqu'il y a une crise telle que la crise sanitaire de la pandémie et de la maladie de la COVID, il va sans dire qu'il y a un choc, effectivement. Donc, voici un peu les raisons qui nous ont poussé effectivement à analyser, dans nos objectifs, effectivement, à vouloir analyser les représentations sociales et les impacts économiques dans le cadre de la diffusion des mesures de lutte contre la COVID-19 dans ce secteur. Et cela nous a conduit à émettre l'hypothèse générale suivante, qui est que la diffusion des mesures de lutte contre la maladie de la coronavirus est source de représentation sociale et d'impact économique dans ce secteur. Et sur la base de cela, en termes méthodologiques, nous avons procédé par une revue analytique. Il faut dire que les premières heures de la COVID au niveau du Burkina Faso, comme un peu partout ailleurs, il n'y avait pas de la documentation à ce sujet, mais quand même, les briefs informations que nous détenions étaient notamment de la presse, notamment la presse en ligne ici, et quelques chercheurs, notamment un chercheur du CNRS du Burkina qui a effectivement écrit un papier et rentrant dans ce cadre. Donc, sur la base de l'analyse de cette documentation qui s'est appuyée en deuxième temps par, comme on appelle ça, des entretiens semi-directifs, notamment sur un certain nombre de sites au niveau des régions minières, nous a permis d'aboutir aux résultats ci-après. Donc, en termes de résultats, nous pouvons rapidement dire que nous pouvons déjà identifier deux types de représentation sociale de la maladie à coronavirus, notamment dans le secteur de l'artisanat minier. Et la première est liée effectivement à la représentation liée à l'existence de la maladie. Ça veut dire qu'il y a un certain nombre d'acteurs effectivement qui croient en l'existence, effectivement, qui ont la perception que c'est une maladie qui existe et que ces acteurs-là sont pour la plupart des acteurs structurés du secteur de l'artisanat minier, notamment les ONG qui interviennent dans l'artisanat minier, les syndicats des orpailleurs ou des artisans miniers. Eux ont la perception effectivement que la maladie existe, contrairement effectivement à une large part des artisans miniers, notamment ceux de la chaîne opératoire. Je veux dire ceux qui sont dans l'exploitation de manière plus directe développent une grande perception du fait que la maladie n'est pas réelle, que la COVID n'est pas réelle, dans la mesure où les symptômes de la COVID, effectivement, est similaire à d'autres maladies, à des maladies au niveau local, par exemple, et auxquelles les artisans miniers sont déjà confrontés. Et les terminologies locales, effectivement, de ces maladies sont telles que le fonce qui est lié un peu aux maladies respiratoires, qui, effectivement, développent des resserrements au niveau des choses. Le fonce et comment on appelle ça? Fonce fulfulbara, et c'est un certain nombre de terminologies en langue locale, notamment en langue locale moara, effectivement, où ces perceptions-là sont développées. Il y a également que ces perceptions d'une existence de la maladie s'explique par l'existence de la COVID s'explique par le fait que les systèmes nosographiques en fait de la maladie. Ça veut dire que, comme tel que je viens de le citer, les différents signes et les différents symptômes pour ces artisans ou pour ces acteurs, ce sont des symptômes qui déjà existent parce que les artisans miniers, déjà avec le travail manuel, la poussière et autres, le fait que... Donc déjà, ils pensent que ce n'est pas une maladie qui est nouvelle. Si elle semble être une maladie, mais elle n'est pas nouvelle pour elle. Donc voici un peu les deux perceptions qui se dégagent dans le secteur de l'artisanat minier. Au-delà de ça, il y a les perceptions liées à la diffusion des mesures. La diffusion des mesures de lutte contre la COVID. Effectivement, les mesures, la première perception à ce niveau présente que les mesures entreprises, notamment au niveau gouvernemental, sont d'ordre général, mais qui, effectivement, ne prend pas en compte, effectivement, comme on appelle, je veux dire, ne prend pas en compte l'expérience des acteurs de l'artisanat minier en matière, effectivement, de prévention d'une crise ou d'une crise qu'elle soit sanitaire, ou pas. Donc, les artisans miniers ont la perception que les mesures étatiques visent effectivement à liquider le secteur de l'artisanat minier parce que c'est un aspect aussi qui est objet de débat dans le secteur où les acteurs ont la perception que le secteur n'est pas pris au sérieux et que le secteur, effectivement, ne bénéficie pas de l'encadrement et de l'appui étatique conséquente. Donc, voilà un peu pourquoi les artisans miniers ont l'impression, ont la perception que ce sont des mesures gouvernementales de lutte contre, comment on appelle ça, la maladie, et visent simplement à mettre fin à leur activité. Et cela aussi se traduit par le fait que sur ces mesures-là, il y a des mesures aussi répréhensibles, voilà, telles que les bastonnades, les pouces sur les sites, sans même qu'il y ait au préalable, effectivement, des notes qui leur sont directement adressées. Voilà, donc voici un peu en ce qui concerne les choses, comment on appelle ça, la perception des acteurs sur, comment on appelle, et sur les mesures de lutte contre la COVID. Et ensuite, il y a, en ce qui concerne l'impact, en termes de résultats, en ce qui concerne l'impact économique, effectivement, de la diffusion des mesures de lutte contre la COVID, il va sans dire qu'il y a essentiellement 5 impacts qui se dégagent à l'issue de l'étude. D'abord, il y a la contraction du marché de l'or, puisque comme nous l'avons dit, nous l'avons analysé et ces représentations et l'impact sur l'artisanat minier de l'or. Voilà, donc il y a une contraction économique du marché local de l'or qui se traduit par une déflation effectivement exponentielle du prix de l'or. Il veut dire qu'au niveau international, c'est qu'au niveau international, le coût de l'or, l'once de l'or n'a pas régressé. Par contre, au niveau local, eu égard des mesures de lutte effectivement contre la COVID, il y a eu une déflation des prix. Et donc, il y a des chiffres peut-être qui seront peut-être présentés dans le PowerPoint. Ensuite, à côté de cette déflation, il y a effectivement, comment on appelle ça, déflation et l'inflation. Il y a une inflation effectivement des matières qui rentrent dans le cadre effectivement de la lutte et qui rentrent dans le cadre de la production de l'or au niveau local, par exemple. Donc, il y a eu tel que le matériel de dynamitage qui a flambé, il y a eu une inflation au niveau de ces matériels, même la nourriture qui rentre dans le cadre effectivement de la consommation des artisans miniers pour pouvoir creuser. Il y a que les pelles, le coût des pelles ont augmenté, des pioches ont augmenté, comme nous sommes dans l'artisanat également. Donc, il y a une déflation des prix de l'or, mais en même temps, il y a une inflation des consommables miniers. Le deuxième impact qui est fort, c'est qu'on a constaté un endettement, effectivement, et la faillite de certains acteurs de l'artisanat minier. Et l'endettement se situe au niveau, par exemple, et la faillite se situe au niveau, par exemple, des acteurs de la chaîne opératoire. Des acteurs de la chaîne opératoire tels que celles qui sont peut-être souvent employés, mais aussi les petits acteurs qui détiennent les galeries, mais qui n'ont pas de moyens à grande échelle pour pouvoir effectivement, et comme on appelle, thésauriser l'or et par la suite la revendre. Donc du coup, ces acteurs-là étaient obligés effectivement de liquider ou de revendre l'or durant les premières heures, malgré qu'effectivement, il y a eu une déflation exponentielle du coût de cours. Ensuite, comme impact important, c'est qu'on a constaté qu'il y a l'afflux de capitaux d'acteurs externes à l'artisanat minier, et notamment des commerçants ou des acteurs politiques, effectivement, qui ont effectivement qui se sont intéressés à l'achat ou à la collecte de l'or comme un moyen de thésaurisation, effectivement, de leurs biens. Donc, du coup, il y a des acteurs politiques et économiques externes, effectivement, à l'artisanat minier qui ont essayé ou qui ont, effectivement, sont intéressés à l'achat d'or pour pouvoir en thésauriser et par la suite pouvoir la revendre. Et la deuxième phase comment on appelle ça, des mesures de la COVID, notamment avec le desserrement, après les 3 premiers mois, et ce qui est ressorti, c'est que ces acteurs-là arrivaient effectivement à les écouler à un prix plus élevé au niveau international. Donc, le quatrième aspect important en termes d'impact, c'est qu'il est ressorti que l'agriculture vivrière était comme un moyen de résilience, effectivement, des acteurs de l'artisanat minier. Parce que, comme vous le savez, au niveau local ici, c'est que la plupart des artisans miniers étaient d'abord comment on appelle ça, des agriculteurs. Donc, ils pratiquent 2 activités en même temps. Donc, le fait que certains artisans miniers avaient des stocks, et comme on appelle, en termes de vivres agricoles, et pendant cette période de la COVID, ils sont arrivés, effectivement, certains sont arrivés à vendre une partie des vivres pour pouvoir éponger les dettes et pouvoir payer les travailleurs, pour ceux qui détiennent les galeries, pouvoir payer les creuseurs et autres pour pouvoir les maintenir. Mais au-delà de ça, ces vivres ont servi de nourrir ces artisans miniers, mais en même temps de nourrir, de supplier effectivement à l'absence effectivement de vente ou de vente d'or ou de leur activité. L'autre impact également qui est ressorti en termes de résultats, c'est qu'il y a eu des gagnants. Et des gagnants, je veux dire, dans le cadre de la diffusion des mesures de la COVID. Et les gagnants, c'est lesquels? C'est ceux, effectivement, comme je viens de dire, les acteurs politiques et d'autres acteurs commerciaux extérieurs au monde de l'artisanat minier qui sont arrivés, effectivement, à thésauriser et acheter à vil prix et à thésauriser. Et la seconde phase des mesures de la COVID les a permis, effectivement, d'en avoir plus. Donc, il y a des gagnants, il y a eu des gagnants et ce que j'appelle également des perdants. Au-delà de ça, en termes de résultats aussi, c'est qu'on a constaté l'inertie d'une structure telle qu'on appelle l'ANEMAS, qui est une structure qui est chargée effectivement de l'encadrement de l'exploitation minière artisanale. Et à son sein, elle dispose d'un guichet d'achat et qui est étatique. Et ce guichet d'achat ou cette institution, effectivement, et pendant cette période, n'a pas joué le rôle qui lui est dévolu. Celle, effectivement, peut-être de pouvoir effectivement approcher les artisans miniers et de pouvoir protéger les intérêts des artisans miniers dans ce contexte. Elle s'est enfermée dans les mesures gouvernementales en se contentant minimum du service minimum bureau et en occultant effectivement les acteurs vers lesquels elle et sa naissance a été dédiée. Donc, du coup, il y a eu vraiment, et ça a mené cette répercussion-là, bon, cet impact-là en termes de perte, par exemple, au niveau de l'artisanat minier. Donc, ce que je peux dire, et ce que je pouvais dire en quelques minutes, je ne sais pas si je suis toujours dans le temps, voici un peu, je pense que peut-être au cours des débats, au cours des échanges, s'il y a des interrogations, je pourrais peut-être revenir. Sur ce, je vous remercie. Merci bien.
Merci beaucoup, Konkobo. And thank you to you and all the other speakers. All three of them are fantastic and covered a very wide evidentiary and geographical and methodological and social range, which we were very happy about. And this is exactly what we were aiming for. So I will also, I will moderate now Q&A, and perhaps it would be interesting to open it up to the panelists to ask one another questions before we open it up to the attendees.
Yeah, I have a question for Vera. This is not your doctoral quals, so don't worry about it. It's not that kind of question. But I did notice that those of us who are interested in some sense of connecting notions of disease and global justice have to basically fight on multiple fronts. It's not just merely a matter of what we should do for an outbreak, but we find ourselves in the trenches of these kind of deep epistemological conflicts and clashes over the nature of science. And I'm curious if you would speak to your experience, particularly in the context of dealing with, I call them imperial epidemiologists. So what's been your experience?
That is a great question. I think I definitely had an epistemological crisis at some point in my PhD that was sort of evolving throughout my career. But I started my studies as a biochemist, so I was a scientist. And as I started to look into the social causes and drivers of disease more and more, something wasn't really adding up. Applying those scientific methods to study social phenomenon was just not adding up. So, and I think I'm still very critical of certain approaches that are very positivist approaches that are used. And I think I see it in some ways as somewhat organized, because it definitely, you can go to departments that are having this hierarchy of evidence of having like RCTs and quantitative studies at the top. And all of the discussions that they're having is basically on methods and what kind of statistical analysis would have been more appropriate for this question or that question. And almost all critical discussion on issues is lost. So yes, I definitely think that there needs to be more discussion on why we as social scientists sometimes, most often people don't even think about why they are using the epistemological lens that they are using. And yes, I think this is a huge challenge because funders are funding mostly quantitative studies, and I see it more as an organized way of limiting academic thinking in a lot of ways. But of course, not all quantitative evidence is bad. And, there are certain questions and certain phenomenon that you can actually measure. And it is powerful to be able to have that data. But I think to have this push to move everyone towards this, to move like all social and political sciences towards this approach is particularly problematic. And I think, I hope that there would be some sort of a shift in direction, but I don't really see it happening.
Yeah, the funny thing is that what most of them don't realize, and these are the true believers, True believers you can't have a conversation with because, you know, if they're corrupt enough to know this, then you can begin to work on them. But the true believers really don't understand that their methods are also historicized, and deep down into the very mathematical formalisms are presumptions of the nature of nature and you know, cultural impulses, imperial objectives. I mean, it's all interwoven into the very mathematics that they ostensibly feel is divorced from you know, those issues of having to violate Hume's guillotine, the notion that you need to separate out what's the nature of the world with what you feel about it, right? But in the course of doing that, they also violate that by smuggling in all the very things they presume that they're keeping out. And what I like about your talk is that, I mean, I know I wasn't alone in this, but to see someone converge on those, that understanding really drove home for me that that your basic beige normcore science, establishment science, is totally an imperial project, and to see it because you know, there's an element of training that goes in. There's a filtering process. You spoke about the grants, but extends to the hiring practices, to you know, all the way down into high school biology, and so what we're up against is as deeply powerful and expansive as the pandemic itself, because I mean, it emerged in part by virtue of the system that brought it about, the very system that's now studying the thing that it helped bring about. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, the capacity, the necessity to, you know, put the blinders on is so more important than actually solving the problem, really. Yeah. And it brings up H. Bruce Franklin, and then I'll shut up. It brings up H. Bruce Franklin's notion that the one that Cedric James stole and Zizek stole, and it's a good one to steal, the notion that, you know, they're more interested in, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I mean, that's the entire apparatus is involved in propping up the system that brought up both the pandemic and climate change and all these other things. And so no solution goes through unless it also allows the normal that brought this about to continue.
Exactly. That is the sad reality. Okay, well, let Max.
Yeah. Max, we're done talking.
You're done. No, we're all learning a lot, so it's quite fun actually. But are there other questions for you guys have for one another? Concobo, est-ce que vous avez des questions pour les autres intervenants, les autres personnes?
Probablement pas. Comme avec la langue, la communication est difficile. Je n'ai pas de questions.
There's a connection issue. Okay.
Moi, non, je dis que j'ai pas de questions.
Okay. Bon. So let us open it up to the audience.
J'aurais une question, Max. Yeah?
Ah oui.
Merci. Sorry, Vera, I don't know if French is problematic for you, but anyway, it's a general question and we'll talk in French in case some auditors are around and they don't speak English. Actually, my English is not good enough to speak in English, so let's go in French. J'ai une question très générale et d'abord merci beaucoup pour les 3 interventions ma question concerne j'ai failli dire juste et alors et maintenant on en est où là? Et il y a plusieurs niveaux. Le premier niveau, c'est le niveau nord-sud, parce que ce problème de la pandémie et d'autres pandémies, je ne vais pas revenir sur les différentes explications, Rob, tu as écrit beaucoup là-dessus, et d'autres, ils l'ont fait, donc on ne va pas revenir là-dessus. Là, aujourd'hui, il y a une urgence. Quand on dit, moi je suis tout à fait d'accord, j'essaie de pousser dans cette direction que la souveraineté alimentaire est une solution. Mais tout ça, c'est du long terme ou du moyen terme au moins. Aujourd'hui, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? On sait, moi je suis tunisien et notre camarade de Concobo et de Burkina et d'autres qui viennent du sud, les gens dans mon village, les gens ne font absolument plus aucune attention, aucune protection. Parce que quand il se lève le matin, sa réflexion, c'est pas comme moi, qu'est-ce que je dois faire pour me protéger? Parce que financièrement, je suis protégé et donc je cherche la protection physique de la santé. Et d'autres, quand ils se lèvent le matin, ils disent « Mais moi, comment je vais protéger moi et comment je vais nourrir mes enfants ?» Et on vit des moments très, très étonnants en ce moment, c'est dramatique. Il y a les enfants, les jeunes qui traversent la Méditerranée ou l'océan pour traverser vers le nord. Et quand on leur pose la question « Mais pourquoi vous risquez de mourir dans la mer? Pourquoi vous faites ça ?» Ils disent qu'on est déjà mort. Et dans les villages tunisiens et ailleurs dans les pays du Sud, les gens disent la même chose. On s'en fout du Covid. On veut manger. À court terme, est-ce que on peut parler en termes de... Non, pas de solution, il n'y a pas de solution à court terme. Mais est-ce qu'on peut parler un peu de la justice vaccinale ou des inégalités vaccinales? C'est quoi il y a de nouveaux monopoles qui se constituent au niveau du droit à la santé. Les pays qui ont les moyens d'acheter ou de fabriquer des vaccins, ils arrivent à se protéger à peu près autant que possible. Je ne sais pas si c'est vraiment protecteur. Et alors que dans les pays du Sud, c'est n'importe quoi. Est-ce que, je ne sais pas, enfin voilà, un ensemble de questions juste pour polémiquer un peu, mais au fait, je sais qu'il n'y a pas de réponse.
Okay, so go, whoever wants to address it.
I'll have to say I need a little help with translation. I you know, like I said, do you?
The problem with the translation is I have to do it myself now. No, I mean it's an issue of course, one is a global issue, okay. And there is the long processes of where the virus or the comes from, or where we are going in the long term or middle term. Now, many people are without any protection. There is a kind of vaccinal, I don't know if it's English enough, vaccinal injustice or iniquity. And how to problematize now in terms of North and South, in terms of a new monopoly, okay? Those who have the money to protect themselves in the North and other rich countries, they can do it. But in the South, no one has this accessibility to vaccines or to any other. There is nothing else than vaccines for now. And they cannot stay home. I'm home because I have a salary which comes every month. But many people have to go out for work. And their emergency is not a protection against the virus, but a protection against for food, right. Immediate food. Right. It's not a question, it's just to open a bit the...
Got it.
Moi, je vais peut-être réagir à la question, à une des questions. Bon, je ne sais pas si c'est une réponse ou pas, mais ce que je pourrais dire en ce qui concerne les inégalités dans le cas de la gestion de la maladie coronavirus, je peux dire dans le cas de l'artisanat minier ou dans le secteur dans le secteur minier au Burkina Faso, cette inégalité est déjà perceptible. Déjà dans le secteur minier, parce que comme vous le savez peut-être que, et vous le savez aussi comme moi, c'est qu'au niveau du Burkina par exemple, le secteur de l'artisanat minier est en concurrence avec le secteur de l'industriel, du secteur minier industriel. Donc pendant la Covid, notamment les premières heures, les 3 premiers mois par exemple de la pandémie, vous voyez que le secteur minier industriel n'a pas arrêté de travailler. Elle recevait par exemple les kits de tests sur le site, qui est contrairement à l'artisanat minier qui occupe environ de 10% de la population active, mais qui est resté un secteur où les mesures préventives sont restées, comment on appelle ça, sont restées très marginales. Elles sont restées alors des prescriptions, contrairement au niveau étatique, mais contrairement à certaines ONG qui ont quand même de belles expériences et de beaux résultats en s'intéressant effectivement à la sensibilisation et à mettre des comités de suivi jusqu'à aujourd'hui qui fonctionnent par rapport à la surveillance et sur certains sites. Et ça, par exemple, au niveau étatique, on pouvait au niveau Afrique Sud, par exemple, dans le cadre de l'artisanat minier qui occupe un secteur et un nombre de populations important, de tirer cette expérience, par exemple, tirer des ONG, par exemple, pour effectivement voir si, avec l'évolution de la maladie, voir avec une approche participative, pour que même si la situation doit s'empirer, au niveau, par exemple, Afrique, au niveau du secteur de l'artisanat minier, qu'elle soit résiliente ou qu'elle n'impacte pas aussi ce secteur qui est si fragile parce qu'il a de l'économie informelle. Donc, du coup, je suis d'avis avec vous que cette inégalité-là, effectivement, elle existe, même dans le secteur minier, elle a existé et elle continue d'exister parce que le traitement n'est pas, le traitement étatique des deux sous-secteurs ne sont pas les mêmes. Donc, voici ce que je pourrais dire. Mais à l'étape actuelle au Burkina Faso, par exemple, dans le cadre de l'artisanat minier, et les artisans miniers à l'étape actuelle ont la perception générale que du déni de la maladie. Pas parce que certains n'ont pas conscience que la maladie n'existe pas, mais parce que les mesures de lutte, effectivement, pourraient effectivement mettre fin à leur vie quotidienne, à leur activité économique. Donc, raison pour laquelle certains acteurs tentent de nier effectivement la maladie. Certains même expliquent qu'ils ont cru à la maladie parce qu'ils ont entendu qu'il y a un pasteur qui a été contaminé parce que lui, il est chrétien et comme c'est un pasteur qui qui se sont, c'est un passé, par exemple au Burkina Faso, parce que les premiers cas ont été importés par un couple religieux et certains estiment qu'ils croient à l'existence de la maladie parce qu'effectivement, c'est un pasteur qui l'a exporté, qui l'a importé au fait. Donc, du coup, mais à l'étape actuelle, je pense qu'au niveau de l'artisanat minier, l'existence de la maladie s'est estompée et il y a un déni carrément de la maladie, le fait que des mesures étatiques ne sont pas de façon participative et ne tiennent pas compte du vécu quotidien et de l'expérience, effectivement, de ces acteurs-là, de sorte, effectivement, à injecter moins de ressources, mais qui pourraient favoriser, effectivement, des résultats énormes pour la protection sanitaire des acteurs de ce secteur. Bon, bref, voici ce que j'avais peut-être comme ajout. Ce n'est pas une réponse directe à monsieur, mais bon, voilà. Merci.
Yeah, my answer goes along all sorts of different ways because it's a very the crux of a question for sure. But you know, in the early days, March 2020, you have even the United States, such an example of the racial capitalism at the heart of things, where you know photos of black and brown workers on the subway crowded together to go to work to do the services and goods and services to allow the for the most part, white professional managerial class to stay home and, you know, be good citizens by virtue of participating in public health and, you know, and letting those who service them take the blow. That happens within the global north and, of course, across the global north, global south divide. The early days, it was thought that the global south, for some reason, wasn't getting hit as hard. So there were elements of, well, is it we just not don't have the epidemiological capacity to you know, count who's been getting sick. Those who are sick, you know, perhaps don't have the access to medical care that would register in any you know, epidemiological survey. There was thoughts that perhaps people in the global south had been, you know, by virtue of being, you know, collected together in that they would be routinely exposed to corona-like pathogens that will allow them to have some sort of resistance to it. I think, however, it's becoming fairly clear, though, that places like Brazil and India are putting the kibosh on that, meaning it's probably not the case, and that we're having in this third or fourth wave the global south starting to get truly, you know, decimated in a way that it hadn't before. So the hopes and dreams of poverty as some sort of protection is not proving to be the case. So what does the global left have to do? You know, on the one hand, we have to do two things at one at the same time, and that is we have to demand that the global north hand over, you know, the vaccine. You know, it has to be globalized. Many of the vaccines were tested on populations of the global south. So imagine, you know, you're testing your vaccines in Brazilian populations and now they're not allowed to have access to it. I mean, it's a profound injustice in there. And also it makes dumb epidemiology. I mean, the notion that you won't vaccine as many people as possible because it's a global virus that goes across borders and doesn't participate with your geopolitical concerns. And ironically, and this the horror here is to see, you know, yeah, if you have you know, the chance to get a vaccine, you should do it, and most definitely. But there's a horror to see here in the States, people walking around like it's over, while millions around the world are suffering in a way that you know, it's very much provincial and cruel in its focus on what's happening to us here in the global north, and that's it. But it makes bad epidemiology because as the virus circulates around, it evolves, and you have all the variants that are emerging, and they are getting out from underneath whatever so-called herd immunity might emerge, and whatever vaccines that we have. So already the South African variant is resistant to the AstraZeneca vaccine. And the P1 in Brazil shows some resistance to the Pfizer vaccine. And so you let the pathogen circulate around, and it has the capacity to evolve out from underneath our vaccines. I mean, do we really want to continue on with this outbreak and pandemic? Well, then it requires global solidarity. And so there's the two things. One, and it's always been part of the left to announce and fight for the right for all people to have access to the latest medical innovations. And in this case, not only is that just, but it's necessary because it protects the entirety of the world. And the notion of protecting vaccine patents that were paid for by people, by taxpayers and the general public, so that some of these companies can make money is outrageous and absurd and detrimental to global health. And then the other hand, we have to continue to argue that medical innovations are necessary but not sufficient. They're not enough. They're not going to stop this outbreak from happening. We need to continue to do the non-pharmaceutical interventions. You have all sorts of different countries, very different political systems, China, New Zealand, Vietnam, Taiwan, Cuba, Uruguay, who have been able to stop their outbreaks by non-pharmaceutical interventions entirely. So they would allow people to stay home because they were paid to stay home. They were given all the masks and such. You bunk down for about 2 or 3 terrible months, and it clears out. And the insistence on all the neoliberal countries to keep things going, keep the factories going and the meatpacking plants, both global north and global south, means that the pathogen can continue to circulate. So you allow this thing to circulate as a matter of course, because somebody still needs to be a billionaire, and at the expense of the welfare and well-being of the entirety of the world. So I would say those two things, we fight to make sure push through vaccine apartheid, and we also say vaccines aren't the entire thing. We need to change the entirety of the ways by which the metabolism of the global metabolism in terms of relationship between economy and ecology are related to each other, so that we do not allow these pathogens to keep coming up. It's not going to be another 100 years until the next outbreak. It's not going to be 1918 to 2019. It's going to be happening a lot more frequently, and in a way that requires us to completely redesign and reconfigure the way we, as humanity, appropriate things from nature and survive. And not organize ourselves around the prime directive of expropriation, so that a few billionaires can, ruin the rest of the world. One last point. I often say that Elon Musk, the billionaire in America who has all the spaceships, he is going to take us to Mars, but it's not going to be a spaceship. Elon Musk and all the billionaires are going to turn Earth into a dust bowl. And so we'll already be here in Mars if we allow them to continue to operate. I mean, these are sociopaths. And I don't mean in the medical sense. I mean, in the sense of being completely bonded to a form of metaphysics and political economy that is about destroying Earth and all the things upon which we depend to survive as a species. And they can no longer have control of this because it's just ruinous on all sorts of levels. And so global solidarity is necessary, that peoples around the world start to organize in a way to start to move to remove that kind of stuff, that kind of control, because otherwise we'll continue to be faced by these dynamics. And what they've done here with vaccine apartheid for a pandemic, they're signaling to us what they're going to do when the real serious damage of climate change starts to arrive.
I'm just going to add one thing. I couldn't agree more with everything that Rob said, and unfortunately I couldn't understand the French. But I just wanted to add that it is often and times I've thought about this, that we are in, an international crisis of global health, and there is almost no power over the geopolitical decisions that that are made. And I mean, the only international organization that has can produce mandates, can mandate states to act in a certain way is the UN Security Council, and even that cannot enforce imperial powers, or, well, namely the United States, to take away sanctions on countries that are suffering during a pandemic. And so like being from Iran and speaking to people from Venezuela and Cuba during this pandemic has really shifted my focus as a global health practitioner, which I think that it just makes you feel extremely powerless. And I mean, what is the, like, we have international crises that are outside of the security dimensions that the Security Council considers only. And even if the Security Council member states want to make different decisions, I mean, with the structure itself, with the permanent members and the veto power, there is never going to be any kind of real change. And this is just, again, like as the pandemic is sort of like an indication of what could happen when we are in the time of severe climate crisis, it is also an indication of what happens to countries that are faced with, war and severe crises, that they cannot argue, they cannot have a global health or development argument outside of this framework that is only there to sort of protect the geopolitical interests of the imperial countries. So I think that, that is also another grim reality that we are operating within.
Rob, you're muted. That's the battle cry of 2021. I hope we can make it something different. And that is, I mean, there are some grim realities, but there's also a notion that increasingly people are waking up to this. I feel it. And, even within the United States, people polled demand the vaccine apartheid end. I mean, there is the notion of appealing the people out beyond the Westphalian system that has been imposed, and beginning to, in the face of difficult circumstances, beginning to build parallel governance out from underneath that. And that's all much easier said than done, but having people begin to unplug out of the presumptions of a sociopathic system is an incredibly important moment, and possibilities. I don't think history is quite etched in stone. I know, history is littered with collapsed civilizations, but also, peoples around the world who have been able to continue in the face of considerable horror and damage. And, we can build futures out of, in some sense, recovering those histories to build a rationale for a change in direction. And I think we're at a precipice here that we have kind of no choice but to, arrive at a historical moment and attempt to make these changes. It is daunting, but it is also, as we have all gone through this past year, and as people in the global south have gone through for the last 500 years, this is cannot, in my view, continue if we have any interest in remaining alive as a species.
There is no questions from the audience. Max?
I have a question, but I was waiting to see if someone from the audience had any contributions or any issues to pose. If not, I have have a question, half question, half comment, and for Vera, which is, I mean, it seems to me that you know, what you were describing about the reactions of from the global north right to the kind of bestiary which passes for the global north left in reaction to anything at all Iran did in reaction to the sanctions. I mean, in reaction to Corona. In fact, you know, a well-known kind of neocon Marxist was upset that Iran initially had a good reaction to the sanctions. Andreas Malm, it was sort of unbelievable. So it seems to me that Iran is kind of under a double blockade, right? It's under like an epistemological blockade where like Iran isn't allowed to like even exist in the sense of like its reality can't exist on the one hand, and then there's like this blockade where the U.S. is using that to cut off Iran from the world, right? And you know, as someone who is really, you know, as someone who could not be working more closely directly on these issues, like what do you think needs to be done to deal with these issues, both at the ideological level, but of course also at the political level?
Yes, I think that that is really how it feels like, right? It's like a circular path where Iran's reality is not allowed to be presented in any sort of sympathetic or real way. And whenever there is any kind of a portrayal on Iran, it's sort of like used to just delegitimize the Iranian government and sort of like score points. So sanctions themselves are an exact mechanism for that like you are putting a country under extreme pressure, and then you're sort of using the misery narratives that are coming out to your benefit. And whenever that there is any sort of positive, or not positive, but any sort of good way to mediate sanctions effect, you're not going to sort of portray that. And of course, on the Iranian side, the response would be that on the one hand, the government wants to admit that sanctions are putting a lot of pressure on Iran, but on the other hand, they also, well, in reality, it's not like the Iranian economy under the most extreme sanctions completely collapsed. And I think that is a point to make as well. Internally, I understand why the Iranian government wants to make that point, because if you don't sort of like resist, and if you don't show that your sanctions are actually ineffective, then I don't think that the imperial power will stop. I don't think that the concern by the countries that enforce sanctions is that like they're not going to stop or remove sanctions because people are suffering. They actually want people to suffer so that they would then overthrow the Iranian government. And I think that the only response to that I see is really to resist, which is why, you know, it becomes, you have to sort of make a stance. Like you are outside of that global order, whether it is on the more sympathetic side of the left or the right. It's sort of like these countries are, their stories and their realities are like, it's just too complicated. We can't get engaged in that. And it is this sort of like geopolitical strategy, and, you know, no one really wants to get like involved in that messy business almost. But I think that, like internally, I understand every measure that is being taken here to sort of like become more self-sufficient and have a resistance economy and sort of like, you know, try to not rely at all on the global order, although that is impossible. So like there is definitely attempts to not be completely isolated and remove sanctions, but the only way to sort of go forward is to try to resist and see where we will be when there's at least not one superpower, but maybe like a more of a balanced system, or, you know, when there is slow change in terms of like the geopolitical power structures globally.
I have another question in terms of just suggesting a certain direction. Could we imagine that the global capital or global north, global capital, hasn't any interest on stopping the pandemic to protect itself, and in somehow we will be protected by the global capital because it needs it? Could we imagine something like that to get some hope?
You know, you're asking a sociopathic system whether or not it wants to protect itself, and there, you know, there's no monolith, right? So even within large institutions, there are going to be different competing forces in terms of what they think about what to do. I think the way I view it is that largely up until now, you know, and I'm not original in describing this, but the global north has largely treated the global south as both as its refrigerator and its toilet, leaving millions of people a year to die by virtue of that for hundreds of years. But now it's done so much damage that it's produced what the philosophers call these hyper objects, meaning these events and circumstances that are everywhere all at once. So that's what a pandemic is, right? That is what climate change is. So the damage of the kind of expropriation of disconnecting humanity out of the ecological matrix that it's a part of has produced these outcomes that are almost geological in their force and impact. And so now the global north is worried about the damage it does, but it does so not in terms of thinking about reorienting our relationship with nature or reorienting our relationship with peoples around the world. And there is a sense of doubling down on things in such a way that the system that caused the damage is the system that's going to get us out of the damage. And it's such a imprint upon everything from the kind of a politics of respectability that if you really want to be considered for tenure in the empire, then there's some things that you have to accept as what's necessary. So in some sense, I'm talking out loud. I'm thinking out loud here, but and I'm not coming to a conclusion that bodes well in that direction. But you almost get a sense. I mean, it's been written up. I mean, it's been on the books for hundreds of years. You have these contradictions already built into the system, and so you have the Lauderdale paradox, in which, as the land is destroyed, what's left over becomes more valuable. So the rush for the land left over, the last of the Congo and the Amazon, is that much more valuable to a capitalist system. So they're interested. You know, when I was a kid, we did a report on Ecuador, and at least even then, I saw the maps of the Congo and the Amazon say, at least we won't destroy those things. You know, as a kid, those are the lungs of the earth, right? And yet here we are, that's exactly what we're doing. So notions of pulling back up to try to keep the system from destroying itself in a kind of Keynesian kind of notion, it doesn't appear to be in power at this point. And the unfortunate sociopathic nature momentum is still very much in place. This is why I very much speak of kind of, it's hard to parlay with true believers because their notions of the outcomes that we speak of here can be anything other than directed to other causes, right? So the pandemic is, you could blame the Chinese, you can blame smallholders, you can blame the virus. There's always something else to point fingers at. in a way that allows the system that brought this about to wash its hands. So I am presently, if I'm not pessimistic. I try to engage in the kind of active optimism and the notion that things can change. But I think looking toward those who brought about the damage, even with time ticking away like this, it might not be the way to go. I'm more interested in notions of people who understand what's going on, beginning to find each other and organize with each other in the face that, you know, something else can be built in real time, from, you know, local mutual aid up through more larger mechanisms of parallel governance, and in the push toward fighting back, you know, against those who have that power. So that's where my thinking is at this point, and I don't really have much faith in, and I see them every day here in the States, in the system's representatives arriving at some understanding that some changes have to be made beyond a kind of Biden-level Green New Deal, right, Max?
Yeah.
Toward other things in which, you know, other peoples, other polarities of growing power and persuasion are necessary.
Free the land.
Thank you. And yes.
That's the basic issue.
Yeah. Can I ask Konkobo a question, if we have time? Konkobo, rebonsoir de nouveau. J'aimerais avoir, on n'arrive pas de, moi je suis en France maintenant, je n'arrive pas à avoir une idée si au Burkina il y a un débat sur cette question des pandémies, ou si les choses sont déjà trop compliquées avec d'autres sujets et que la pandémie est finalement assez marginale. Est-ce qu'il y a un débat sur ces questions?
Ok, merci bien. Et pour votre question, je pense que le débat sur l'existence ou l'ampleur, si vous voulez, je pense que c'est un peu ça, sur l'ampleur des cas de Covid au Burkina Faso. Je pense que le débat quand même s'est estompé un peu, à mon avis. Le débat s'est estompé un peu par rapport aux premières, je veux dire, aux 3 mois ou aux 6 premiers mois de la Covid, notamment, et en 2020. À l'étape actuelle, je peux dire que le débat, s'il y a, c'est peut-être au niveau, comment on appelle ça, au niveau académique, et au niveau académique, peut-être avec les différents colloques qui est mieux ici. Et
We lost him. Come back, please. No. No, I don't think. Yeah,
there he is.
he's there. Yeah.
Et donc, je disais que le débat, quand même, il faut dire que le débat s'est estompé un peu en ce qui concerne la maladie. Maintenant, à l'étape actuelle, ce qu'on peut dire qui commence à faire surface, ces deux derniers mois, c'est le débat un peu sur, comment on appelle ça, les dispositions vaccinales un peu, comment on appelle ça, les mesures vaccinales. Parce que je pense que récemment, le Burkina réceptionnait, et je ne sais pas s'il faut appeler un don ou en tout cas un lot de dispositifs pour la vaccination. Et le débat se pose à un niveau tel que, où effectivement, au niveau, comment on appelle ça, le débat se pose pas forcément dans le milieu académique ou dans le milieu scientifique, mais plutôt au niveau de la perception populaire. Est-ce qu'il faut accepter se vacciner ou est-ce qu'il faut effectivement la rejeter parce que un peu, c'est comment on appelle ça? La question de la vaccination vient un peu avec la question de la théorie du complot qui est là, qui commence, donc c'est ce débat qui commence à faire surface ces derniers temps. Mais sinon, en ce qui concerne les mesures, en ce qui concerne la maladie elle-même, je pense que le débat s'est quand même estompé. Voilà. Et maintenant, ça aussi, ça peut s'expliquer par le fait que les cas, effectivement, de Covid, je veux dire, les cas testés positifs au Covid au Burkina, contrairement, est un peu quand même très bas, et contrairement aux voisins, aux pays voisins tels que la Côte d'Ivoire et autres pays. Donc, ce qui fait que le débat sur l'existence même de la maladie et les mesures de protection ou les mesures barrières se sont quand même estompées. Voilà ce que je peux dire.
Hi, I'm going to have to get off the line here, and I apologize for leaving a little bit early, but I just want to thank you all for inviting me. It's wonderful to meet all the speakers and everyone else here. And I do want to end on a note of hope. Sometimes I don't like that because sometimes people in interviews will ask me, okay, well, do you have any hope? Can you end on a note of hope? And I always feel like I'm being accosted in the street and asked for my papers. Like hope is a kind of placeholder that we need to put in here so that we can leave the meeting and feel much better. But I do want to say that I actually do think that things are possible and very much new futures are possible. And they're already in motion. I mean, there are, over the last few years, I've seen all sorts of new agroecologies emerging and, you know, and of course the Global South have engaged in these for decades in a way that they serve as important examples for those in the Global North who should be shutting up and taking notes and learning. And I think we increasingly see that in that direction, although it may not be happening at the level of the government, or the governments, I mean, but I think everyday people are increasingly waking up to understanding that we are truly a one world, and it's absolutely, utterly necessary that we reach out to each other and begin to have these kinds of conversations and work through this. And it's not easy. I mean, it's ridiculous what we're up against. I mean, the totality of the bourgeoisie who are worked together in these interlocking directorates around the world, even as they also divide and conquer people to go to wars against each other. And we saw this, the pandemic, you have the Americans blaming the Chinese and the Chinese blaming the Americans. And meanwhile, they are all, you know, working together and serve on each other's boards. You know, some of the investment units in New York invest in Chinese agriculture, and then of course the Chinese help own Smithfield, so on and so forth. But I'd like to see that this kinds of you know, reaching out across everyday people continues, because I really do feel like that the ideas and ways forward to get out of the traps that we've been placed in extend beyond those in power presently and those who are those who Vera has observed in her studies and their analysis and research. And I do really think that we can move toward these new epistemes, these new ways of thinking and being that all quickly converge on practical solutions that allow us to sidestep some of the worst of damage that we are finding ourselves in.